Welcome. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has today unveiled his long-awaited victory plan. Its aim is to strengthen Ukraine's position enough to end the war with Russia. Zelensky told the parliament in Kyiv today that the strategy includes lifting Western restrictions on long-range strikes deep inside Russia, the continuation of the Kursk offensive, and an invitation to join NATO.
The first point is an invitation to NATO now. An invitation for Ukraine to join NATO could become truly fundamental for peace. We understand that NATO membership is a matter of the future, not the present. But Putin must see his geopolitical calculations have failed. The Russians must feel that their Tsar has lost geopolitically. I thank all partners who support the idea that inviting Ukraine to NATO now, with membership later, strengthens everyone.
Well, let's speak on the programme live now to Patrick Berry about that so-called Ukrainian victory plan. He's a senior lecturer in security and he's also a former analyst for NATO. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Big picture, how realistic do you think Zelensky's plan is?
I think an invitation rather than actual joining NATO is quite significant. So it's basically, as you mentioned, trying to show at the geopolitical level that this is gambit by President Putin has failed. The problem I see with it is how do you transition from an invitation, which, you know, the alliance, even though it's probably got some members which don't agree with doing that, could potentially get the consensus for an invitation. But then how do you transition from the invitation to actually becoming a NATO member? There's no point being invited to it because you need the inside to get the security guarantee. So on the one hand, yes, it's decent optically in terms of showing that eventually Ukraine will be in the orbit of NATO. But I struggle to see how it would actually happen because Putin will assess that it's in his interest just to keep the conflict bubbling away in especially eastern Ukraine, like it was on the line of contact after the invasion of the Donbass. So and so that would be hybrid operations or random low scale artillery shelling, even if there was some cessation of hostilities. That's the problem. It's basically the transition from the invite to the reality of being inside, which I think could be really difficult to achieve.
And beyond that question on NATO, which, as you say, is key, one of the other elements Zelensky talked about was the idea of bringing the war more directly to Russians themselves. Let's just have a listen to what Zelensky had to say about that.
It is realistic to both defend our positions on the battlefield in Ukraine and simultaneously bring the war back to Russian territory so that Russians truly feel what war is like. We are not naive. Ukraine does not believe and will not believe that most Russians will realize the depth of Russia's moral downfall, but they must feel the downfall of the Russian army.
And Patrick Berry, look, Zelensky talking there about Russians needing to feel what this war is really like. In practice, I mean, what does that mean? Are we talking about striking cities deep inside Russia? Because we know for the moment that certainly isn't something that has Western support.
Exactly. Look, I think there's an emerging consensus, certainly among those who are most pro-Ukraine and have been, is that for really this problem to be solved of a resurgent Russia petrostate with, basically, a dictator at the top of it, for that threat to be diminished, the whole of Russia, including its military, needs to be defeated in Ukraine, and that's a train of thought. And if you don't do that, and it takes 15-20% of Ukraine, there's some sort of cessation. What's to stop it going again in 2, 5, 10 years when it reconstitutes itself? So there is that train of thought. I actually agree with it. Where I think the issue is, I think this long-range strikes. Ukraine can do what it likes inside Russia. That's simply the rules of the game, and I'm supportive of all that. It would be great if it could develop its own long-range strike capabilities, which it is, of course, with drones, but missiles very rapidly with the help of the West, and that can be done, through certain situations. But the idea of using, it's not going to happen. These long-range precision strike weapons from the US, it's not going to happen because there's no precedent for it. And obviously people with better brains and more intelligence than I have made the assessment that it's too risky for the West to do that.
Something else he talks about, well, the language he uses seems really significant to me. You know, he's talked about it for a long time, Zelensky, as being a victory plan. I wonder if that word is somewhat at odds with what we're actually seeing on the ground in Ukraine. Russia apparently for weeks now making gains in the east, Ukraine looking rather outgunned in a number of places. From a military perspective, how would you characterize what the situation looks like on the front lines right now?
The momentum is with Russia. It's making slow incremental gains, but they're proving very difficult to stop. I don't think there's a massive breakthrough likely, certainly at the moment with the weather in some parts of the country. But in the longer term, there's a risk to the remaining Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, etc. There's a risk to those cities, which are the last ones in the Donbass in 2025 on the current trajectory. But, the West faces a fork in the road here. Both Gaza, the Gaza conflict, the war in the Middle East has sucked attention, public attention, policy attention, military supplies, especially air defense, away from Ukraine. But it's interlinked with what's going on so it's interlinked strategically, of course. It's also interlinked materially. I think we face, coming up to the and after the US election, a real major inflection point for the West here, which is, do we craft a united strategy of those who are willing to basically give Ukraine everything it needs to defeat the Russian military inside Ukraine? And that would be up to and including potentially rotating NATO air defense into Ukraine, with the risk that if they're targeted by the Russians, that's what happens. But it doesn't, Article 5 only applies to territory. So we just give them everything to get the Russians out and show and signal that. And then we turn and we look at the Iranian problem, because I have a feeling that the next few months and the decisions made actually in these next few months could have repercussions now for the rest of certainly the next half of this century.
You touched on this just now, but I want you to unpack a little bit for us how much you think what happens in Ukraine in the next couple of months is contingent upon the Democrats remaining in control of the White House after the election next month.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly what's going on in Donald Trump's mind, but, it's been indicated, certainly through his son and other people, that he would push for negotiation on day 1 or 2 of his presidency. And that would involve Ukraine ceding territory. And look, the mood music, not only, in the Republicans, some of the Republicans, the mood music in the US is a bit that way. Certainly Germany, you've got Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, they've all not been massively supportive of Ukraine. Obviously, Germany's given and the US have given huge amounts of weapons, etc. But it seems that they're moving away, and they view it as, okay, Ukraine has survived. It doesn't have its own its full territorial integrity, but is that any big shakes to us? That's what their view is. I mean, big question then is, what does that say to Russia in the long term? What does it say to the rest of the world about Western commitment, etc.?
Patrick Berry, great to get your views on this. Thank you very much indeed.